In this video, we're going to cover the Arcane Mage single target and AoE strategies. Let's begin by talking about the single target strategy. The single target strategy utilizes a burn phase and a conservation phase. The objective of the burn phase is to do as much damage as possible and burn through almost all of your mana. In the conservation phase, your goal is the exact opposite. It's to stay as close to 100% mana as possible. Let's step through a basic algorithm that talks about the burn phase. On step 1, what you'll be doing is you'll be spamming Arcane Blast until you have around 80% mana. At that point, one thing you can do is use a mana gem to bring you all the way back up to 100% mana. On step 2, that's when we actually pop the mana gem. On step 3, we continually spam Arcane Blast until we have about 35% mana. And on step 4, we cast Evocation to get our mana back to 100%. Right after we cast Evocation, then that means that we left our burn phase and we're now entering our conservation phase. Let's take a look at the strategy for that right now. It consists of 2 bullets. Let's start with the first one. You'll be spamming Arcane Blast until you have 4 stacks of the Arcane Blast debuff, and then cast Arcane Missiles. You really want to avoid casting Arcane Blast if you already have 4 stacks of the debuff, because that's a real mana hog. Let's move on to the next bullet. If you're very low on mana, there's a trick that you can do. You can actually cast Flame Orb, and Flame Orb will repeatedly give you Arcane Missile procs, and then you can benefit by repeatedly casting Arcane Missiles, and that'll actually bring your mana up a little bit. It's a nice trick to know. Before we move on to a demonstration of the rotation, there's another point that I'd like to bring up, and that it revolves around how to use your DPS cooldowns, namely Arcane Power and Presence of Mind. There are a couple of ways that you can cast these 2 spells. One way is to call them from within macros so that the macro keeps them on cooldown for you, or you can assign them to their own key binding and then use them surgically. There are advantages and disadvantages of both approaches. If you take the first approach, where you call them from within a macro, then that can actually result in lower DPS because they're just sort of randomly proccing in an uncontrolled way. The benefit is that you don't have to pay attention to them anymore, and you are assured that they'll always stay on cooldown, so you'll always reap some benefit from them at least. Now, the advantage of the second approach, which is creating individual key bindings for Arcane Blast and Presence of Mind, is you can use them surgically, and in some cases you can achieve some really nice spiky DPS. Say, for example, check my notes really fast. Look at this possible scenario. Say you pop all of your cooldowns at once in a surgical way. Say you cast Mirror Image, followed by Arcane Power, followed by your DPS Trinket, followed by Time Warp, and then you spam a couple of Arcane Blasts, then you pop your Mana Gem, and then you cast Presence of Mind so that your next Arcane Blast is instant. That's something that will almost never happen if you're calling those spells from within a macro. And the disadvantage of individually setting up key bindings for those spells is that it's more work. Let's demonstrate the single target strategy on a target dummy in Org. Normally the first thing I would do is get my mana shield up like this. We're just waiting on our mana gem to come off cooldown. Okay, we're going to go ahead and start. This is the burn phase. We're going to repeatedly spam Arcane Blast until we have about 75 to 80% mana. Usually happens right about now. We're going to pop a mana gem and then go back to spamming Arcane Blast. We're going to keep doing this until our mana drops to around 35%. Okay, so we're spamming Arcane Blast. probably one more. And now we just casted Evocation. This is making us move into the mana conservation phase. Now our goal at this point is to stay as close to 100% mana as possible. So as soon as we hit 4 stacks of Arcane Blast, then we're going to spam Arcane Missiles. As long as we don't spam Arcane Blast beyond 4 stacks of the Arcane Blast debuff, we should stay pretty close to 100% mana. As you can see, there were 4 more Arcane Blasts. Okay, there's 2, 3, 4. Go back to Arcane Missiles. Go back to spamming Arcane Blast like this. Okay, one more Arcane Missiles. See, we're staying pretty close to 100%. One more Arcane Blast, Arcane Missiles, and we have 1 minute left in our Evocation. Okay, now that's the single target strategy in a nutshell. As soon as our Evocation cooldown, or after our Evocation came off cooldown, then we would just rinse and repeat at that point. Let's move on to the Arcane Mage AoE strategy. There are a lot of different ways to conduct the AoE rotation as an Arcane Mage. I'm just going to give you one way because this is a cookie cutter approach that we're taking. So I'm going to give you one approach that I found actually does result in some pretty good DPS. This AoE strategy heavily revolves around 2 spells, Arcane Explosion and Arcane Blast. Let's look at our improved Arcane Explosion talent. As you can see, it really reduces the cooldown, the global cooldown on Arcane Explosion, so that you can spam it really fast like that. Usually what I'll do is if we enter a poll, initially I'll just be spamming Arcane Blast alone like this, but as the mobs approach death, that's when I may start to weave in Arcane Blast casts. Let's go ahead and demonstrate this on the target dummies here. Okay, so let's pretend that there are like 10 mobs around us. So we're just going to come in close like this, start spamming Arcane Explosion. As you can see, it also activated our trinkets and Arcane Power. So they're going to start, they're taking a lot of damage right now. Now let's say that, you know, some of them are approaching death. That's where you may want to start weaving Arcane Blast in like that, or you can alternate Arcane Blast and Arcane Explosion on one target like this. That's another approach that I've used before. Or you can just do it, you know, purely in a random way. But that is the AoE strategy for Arcane Mages in a nutshell. Now that we've covered the AoE and single target strategies for Arcane Mages, let's move on to a real life example in the context of a 5-man dungeon.